Welcome to this very open discussion, I can call it. Is a space which we have been provided by the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to discuss different issues that affect Indigenous peoples in this 18th session of the Permanent Forum. And I think it's been very interesting to have different topics being discussed. Today we are going to discuss about conservation and human rights, considering that all of you in the panel here have worked on issues of human rights, and it will be very interesting to bring this and look at conservation at the same time and see, and then we can be able to see how far, what are the challenges, gaps, and what can we recommend to our Indigenous people wherever they are, or even the agencies, the partners who are working with them, to be able to take some of the issues that we have and that we really recommend as something that is going to help us in terms of the advancement of Indigenous people. And one of the most important things is that I always like to have each and every person introducing themselves so that at least they can pronounce their names in a very, in the way that they want to. And I think I'll start with the lady there. Kate, you can introduce yourself.
I'm Katie Baker, and I'm an investigative reporter for Buzzfeed News based out of London.
Hi, I'm Tom Warren. I'm also an investigative reporter at Buzzfeed News based out of London, where I work with Katie.
I'm Mordecai Ogada. I'm a trained carnivore ecologist, but I consult on matters conservation and Indigenous people's rights. I'm based in Nanyuki, Kenya.
Okay. And my name is Lucy Mulenkei. I will be your host today. Let's start with you, Tom. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience with human rights and working in several areas of different parts of the world? Being a journalist, of course, you have been each and every corner where you look at conservation and issues of human rights. You can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. So I work as a journalist now. My background, my education was actually in social anthropology. And one of my lecturers, Jerome Lewis, who's a specialist in the Congo Basin, had said to me as a student that conservation schemes aren't always good for local communities and Indigenous peoples. And it always stuck with me. And later, as I became a journalist, I thought I'd love to tell this story. One thing that we try and do at Buzzfeed is we try and tell the stories of people whose voices aren't being heard and tell stories globally that need to be told. We thought this was a really important story to tell. So what we did is there were kind of two parts to the project. We travelled to the field, parts of Central Africa and also South Asia, India and Nepal, to meet with communities and to hear their voices and in their own words to hear their experiences, which journalists have in many respects failed to do before. People have, but we wanted to do it in a systematic way and to spend time hearing from people how conservation had impacted them. The second part of the project was based more in Europe and the US. We wanted to find conservationists who had worked for WWF or other organisations and ask them, what was it like for you? To have travelled and to have worked in these regions. Were there problems? Many of them described problems to us. Particularly there was extensive violence in South Cameroon. We found extensive reports of violence in Nepal and in India. And the issue is that there had been we focused on WWF, the issue is that there had been no safeguards around the violence. So when local communities raised a grievance and said, my child was beaten, the charity would fail to investigate it. And that for us there was a real public interest in telling that story. What happens when a charity works in an area where abuses are occurring? What responsibilities does it have to the local community? And so those were the kinds of issues that we wanted to flesh out and to tell as a story.
Thank you very much, and maybe later on I'll follow on to that. Ogada, in January, the UN Permanent Forum again was keen in looking at issues of conservation, human rights, considering that we are discussing here on traditional knowledge, and also we know that it's the year of languages and all these are related. From Africa and especially from Kenya, what would you say about your experience in looking at the issue of conservation and the challenges that many of the Indigenous communities and local communities in Africa have had?
Thank you. I think in Africa, using Kenya as an example, which I'm most familiar with, we are living in an era of extreme duplicity, in that conservation and the tourism industry that incessantly bleeds into the principle of conservation. We have this situation where we want to sort of objectify indigenous cultures in order to please the tourism industry, but we do not want to embrace and help strengthen the indigenous livelihoods that have kept so many of these places in the beautiful state in which we find them. So we find, for example, in Kenya, the tourism industry is full of Maasai beadwork, Maasai dancing, etc. But the same tourism industry actively fights pastoralism, which is the Maasai's livelihood. So I think in Kenya and much of Africa, we have to get rid of the lie that attaches conservation to tourism, that attaches conservation to a certain Western created model, rather than looking at the abilities that people have built over millennia to live with and use their resources sustainably. So I think it's the part of languages is just a small part of it, but very important as well. We cannot value one part of the culture when rejecting another. We can't strive to keep these languages alive when we are killing the culture and livelihoods from which these languages grew. So I think conservation in Kenya, East Africa, and much of Africa has to, in some ways, grow up away from what they were 50, 60 years ago, and they have to become honest. Because with the current level of duplicity, we'll always be in trouble. Yeah.
Kate, as you heard him speak, there is always a problem. And I don't know if you have experience, because it looks like this, is it because of the traditions of these communities? Like, for example, you've experienced also in Congo and other places. Is it because of their traditions? Is because maybe they have not been educated, maybe they don't know some of the laws that makes them always to have challenges and to continue being poor, despite that fact that they are really providing and protecting their land, conserving their lands for tourism, as he has said? Do you think that's the case? And what would you say about that?
Well, that's a large question. I mean, what we found in our reporting really is in line with what you just said, where with WWF, which is what we specifically investigated, if you go online, you see all of this really positive PR about how WWF works hand in hand with local communities and everyone's so happy, and Indigenous people are really at the center of their work. And you won't read one thing really from WWF about abuses by these forest rangers and eco guards, who are often funded and trained and otherwise supported. And in what we found in South Asia and Africa, they're really, we found reports of sexual assaults, murders, beatings, and that's just not something you'll read about at all. So like you said, when it benefits some of these Western conservation organizations, they say, oh, we work really closely with Indigenous people, but we felt that it was really important to bring the voices of the people who had less positive things to say about what was happening to the forefront, and bring that into the conversation.
Thank you. I think you brought, Tom, you brought quite an interesting aspect to say that there are no safeguards. Because I don't think also probably there are any mechanisms for where these communities can go and report, because there is fear, there is something that prevents them to do that. What can you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, so one way that we approached this story was we were looking at it as a kind of compliance issue, like all major organisations, even the UN, will have departments that deal with things like safeguarding and compliance and ethics, and looking at things like, how do we ensure that our work doesn't cause harm to people? And if it has caused harm, how do we make restitution for that harm? How do we correct it? Now, we saw numerous parks. In particular, there was one park in southeastern Cameroon called Lebeke, where WWF had been warned both in 2015 and subsequently in 2018 in two separate studies that there should be a functioning complaint system. Because what happened was that local people, both from the Baka Indigenous community and also Bantu communities, would complain. They would complain sometimes to the state, but often to WWF, and say, it could be anything. You know, I mean, in one instance, Katie and I went and met a young boy. He was 11 or 12 years old, who had been beaten in front of his parents. He'd had his feet, the soles of his feet were flayed with the blunt end of a machete. And his family and his village sent a complaint to WWF. But WWF never investigated that complaint. So they received documentation saying an 11 and 12-year-old boy had been beaten. They never visited the family. They never apologised to the community. Katie and I went to the village. They weren't hard to find, and heard their story. You know.
And we should just say that WWF says that they take every single allegation of abuse seriously and that they'll investigate all of them. And so, you know, we think that what it comes down to in these cases is very simple. If they receive a complaint that a child is being beaten by these eco guards that they're funding, if we're capable of going to investigate it, they should be too.
What about the role of the government? What was the reaction? Because like if you find in some countries they have also, the government has some institutions that they're their own institutions that are responsible to the wildlife.
Yeah, I think there is an issue with governments in that some governments perhaps human rights standards may vary across states. The issue from us, and as we were reporting, is that charitable organisations have quite high standards. They're not held to the same standards as nation states. Charities don't often become involved in policing. But when they do, in a country where there are human rights abuses, what standards does it have to meet? So I think people had looked at the state, though it wasn't something within the course of our reporting that we really looked at. We were looking at particularly the role of charities. You know, what happens if a charitable organisation supports law enforcement professionals who are abusing communities? And that was the kind of very specific focus of what we were trying to explore.
Okay. Kate, you have something to add on that?
Oh no, I was just going to say that, again, we were looking at Western charities in particular. One Western charity, and, you know, in their, they're committing to really high standards. So they're saying regardless of governments, we work internationally, and we're holding ourselves to this very, very high set of standards, and they should be transparent about whether they have struggles in meeting those standards, in our opinion, based on our reporting.
Ogada, we have so many laws in so many different countries, and these laws are instruments that try to bring the perspective that if such problems happen, if communities are displaced, or there's something that is supposed to protect them, these laws, what do they do? Because I know they...
Yes, that's a very important question, because just in reference to what Tom said, we have a situation where we have clear laws. We have a situation where we have very clear laws that govern, for example, mining corporations, oil drilling. There are things that they have to do to make up for whatever the communities might lose due to their activities. But somehow conservation flies under that radar. We do not have, at least speaking about Kenya, we do not have regulatory frameworks that can call out conservation organizations and hold them to account. That is why we have an organizations running programs in Kenya. One of them is the Nature Conservancy, that has this overarching aim to control more and more land. And right now they're doing it through proxies, but through those proxies they are controlling what I'd estimate around 15 to 17% of Kenya's entire landmass through some of these agreements that are again secret and not lodged in any government office or based in any law. So we must simply hold conservation to the same standards that we hold industry, business, sports, or whatever other human endeavors, because we even have organizations like Space for Giants that is purportedly conserving elephants. If you go on their website, they say that one of the benefits of giving them donations is they give you access to heads of states of the countries that have signed on to join this strange animal they call the Giants Club. It's there on their website. It's not hidden. So we must relook and rethink about these things, because conservation very much in many parts of Africa seems to be the last remnant of colonialism. It's the one area where you can trample on local people's rights and get away with it. And talking about state actors, again, they come in as charities, purportedly supporting the state statutory conservation agencies. But eventually they start supplanting them. Like it's a bizarre issue what even Tom referred to of a charitable civil society organization running armed law enforcement. There's an ethical problem there. They get a lot of funding here from big and small donors who are generally pacifist, inclusive, proletarian sort of conservation people. And when they get over there, they're right-wing, they're uniform, boots on the ground, etc. So it's important to educate people in Kenya, in Africa, and here as well, so that they know the money they're giving is not just for these friendly, happy causes. Some of the money they're giving is actually going towards violation of human rights. And this is something that really needs to come out strongly.
Yeah, indeed, it's a problem, and I think Ogada, you've seen even in Kenya itself, human rights abuses have occurred. It's not only actually in Congo alone, but they've occurred. And right now we have cases in court where we have the public just straying a little bit to the park, and they are shot dead. And the other big issue that we have is the question of compensation. You've really mentioned and said that, this child was hurt, and the issue of compensation is still a big problem. So I don't know whether you found out whether these agencies have got any programs on compensation. If they're not investigating, then it's totally abuse of human rights, because they're supposed to also take precautions and be able to know that this is what can happen and this is what we can be able to do. Maybe one of you can comment on that.
Do you mean compensation if somebody is killed by either a forest ranger or by an animal?
Or even hurt, as you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that we found in our reporting, for example, I can speak about my reporting in Nepal. The Nepali government is supposed to pay compensation to people who are hurt in the situations you're describing. And based on our reporting, we interviewed victims, family members who did not receive the money they were told they would get. That came up repeatedly. I think that WWF says, this isn't up to us. We're not the government. We can't control what they do. And again, what we were looking at in our reporting is what responsibility does a charity such as WWF have to step in and say, we're going to advocate for Indigenous people here. And as I think I keep saying, we feel that if they're going to say we work hand in hand with these communities and this is something we care about, perhaps they should be stepping up instead of taking a step back and saying, well, this is a matter for the government, not for us.
Tom, could you tell us probably what do you think could be done when you see such solutions, especially from the community first and maybe from the other steps before I come to you, Ogada?
Yeah, of course. For me personally, it's very difficult for me to prescribe a solution. As a reporter, we have quite a kind of bounded responsibility. We're very good at going and finding whistleblowers and speaking to people. And I'm sure Mordecai will have such a deep kind of theoretical knowledge that would far outstrip anything I could add. What I can tell you is what we've heard from the people that we speak to as part of our reporting. Speaking to Indigenous rights groups, people have called for more awareness of FPIC, in that Indigenous people give proper consent for their lands to be used and that they're engaged in projects. We've also heard calls for restitution, not just when there's violence, but also restitution when livelihoods are lost. Those calls have been pretty, say we've heard them from a lot of people in different regions. The one thing that unifies everybody, though, that we found through our reporting is, and I really want to make the point of this, is there's not a single person we've spoken to who doesn't recognise the importance of conservation. There are many Indigenous people and Indigenous activists who are deeply pro-conservation. The only difference is that they want to be involved in conservation. They want to find a form of conservation that aligns with their own livelihoods and with their own cultural practices, which, according to international law, they have the right to. So I think in that case, me personally, I don't have any prescriptions, but the people I've spoken to all advocate similar things. They're pro-conservation, and they want to find a way that it works with local communities and Indigenous peoples. So,
yes, that also brings me to the question which I wanted to ask, if any one of you has a case, a positive case to share, because let's put WWF away first and look at some of the cases. And I know a case like in Namibia, where we have the communities who are really managing their own conservancies, and they are really bringing money. And at one point we visited the Indigenous communities, and the director was saying, sometimes when as government we are broke, they can lend us money, which I thought that was really a positive way to be recognized as Indigenous people. I just want to hear whether there is any one of you who can share maybe any positive story that probably you've heard of Indigenous communities doing that conservation, being appreciated, and really feeling that they have done something to their communities.
Maybe I can share one case I'm familiar with in Kenya, and it's in the Masai Mara area. There's a conservancy called Nashulai Conservancy, and it is run by locals. They make their agreements. The Nature Conservancy is not involved. There's no big international NGO involved. They make their agreement whether with tour operators and all that, and they're a model of how it can be done. Although I think the challenge we have in Kenya is that these big international conservation NGOs have become they've become like the tail that's now wagging the dog, rather than the other way around. And as far as we are talking about possible solutions, I think when we are talking about conservation, first of all, we need to, with all due respect to them, tourists and tourism interests need to leave the room. They have no place in it. They are business people. When we are discussing conservation, that's a principle. And then secondly, we must set up a set of guidelines in terms of things like free, prior, informed consent. By definition, free, prior, informed consent cannot be quick. Even at the most basic level, when it's maybe a couple agreeing to get married, that's never quick. So we can't claim that we have some free, prior, informed consent at the speed of some of these conservation projects. That can't happen. Then finally, I'd say an audit mechanism. We have audit mechanisms for human rights, for various forms of governance, rule of law, treatment of children, children's rights, etc., etc. We must have an audit mechanism at a high level, like at the UN level, that we can refer to for this. And once we have that, I think we have something to which we can hold them and say you have to adhere to this. And it's also important for the duplicity to end. We are in the information age. People in the West must read up on the internet, etc., and find out what's going on with this organization they're giving money. I mean, if you refer to look at some of the symbols, WWF symbol is a panda, this really cute animal, and they give these really cute stuffed toys and stuff to inspire sort of the love for what they're doing, the animals and what they're doing. But we must look beyond that, because we're in the information age. It's very easy to find out now what's happening in Kenya. Even any of the things I've spoken about, it's easy to just get on your computer right now to check out and ground truth it. So we must have an audit mechanism, strong institutional audit mechanisms that countries will sign up onto. We must get tourism out of the room. tourism is a byproduct, should never be the reason for conservation. It's a byproduct of conservation. So I think put that in its place and we will be on the track to doing the right thing. And again, we are addressing living systems. So let's not imagine that we'll set up something today that will be working perfectly 50 years from now. And we must also move away from primitive solutions like fencing. It's sad that in this day and age, people with PhDs come up with fencing as a solution to conservation issues. That was cutting edge about 4,000 years ago with the Great Wall of China and that kind of thing. So let's be proactive and be agile enough to have the sophisticated or elegant solutions we need. Yeah.
Okay, Kate, anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with Tom that as journalists, it's our place to bring what we see as marginalized voices in the mainstream media to the forefront and listen to them. I wanted to echo Tom in saying that everyone we spoke to, of course, all the Indigenous activists we met with said that conservation was deeply important to them, that they want and they deserve, of course, a seat at the table because these are their ancestral lands and they're the best stewards of the land and they are the ones that have been taking care of it for centuries. And that really, I hope resonates in our piece that I think that when Indigenous people are treated as the enemy instead of, the partners with these organizations, that does not curb poaching. In fact, it might make people more likely to want to assist poachers coming in from out of town. That's something that we heard a lot about, that alienating locals is not going to stop poaching. And if that's what everyone's trying to do, it's incredibly counterproductive, as well as, in many cases, against the laws that govern Indigenous rights over these lands.
Thank you, Kate. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, Katie encapsulated it so well. I mean, I think, the one thing I would add actually is I work on a range of stories. So I do stories about national security issues, about police misconduct, about banking misconduct. This was a very difficult area to report on. I don't think that conservationists are bad people. I don't think there's any real kind of ill malicious intent, and I really want to stress that. It's simply that there has been very often a blindness as to what can be the impact of conservation and of conservation models. There's an issue as well that one thing I've noticed is it seems much of the theory that underpins conservation comes from Western academia, and perhaps it's been there's been a lack of awareness of the perspectives of people who live in regions. That being said, I mean, the other thing that personally, it was a real pleasure. I'm a journalist. I've worked for the national press in the UK. I now work for an international media organisation. I feel very fortunate to work for a news organisation where we were encouraged to travel to the field and to hear the voices of Indigenous people. It would have been very easy for us to go to Geneva and to try and find people to speak to, but we didn't want to do that. And I think kind of professionally and personally, that's been a real learning experience for me. And I think even as journalists, we need to think about the way that we report these issues. How do we ensure that we hear the voices of Indigenous people? How do we report them correctly and fairly? So that the media kind of works for everyone, really. So.
I just wanted to not to criticize, our competitors' work, but I do think that there are a lot of puff pieces out there about conservation where people are just kind of getting a paid trip to some park where they're hopping on the back of an elephant and they're going on these, anti-poaching expeditions, and it's presented as, this very clear good guys, bad guys situation where the poachers are the bad guys and the rangers are the good guys. And it's just, we felt that was the only story being told in the mainstream media. Of course, Indigenous rights activists and groups have been talking about this for decades, but we really hadn't seen other investigative reporters take this seriously and get the financial documents and the records to back up a story that could really provide a more complex view. And we were something that Tom and I talked a lot about on our first reporting trip is just how this really was all in plain sight. Yes, it's expensive to travel, and we're very grateful that we were able to. But, you know, one of the alleged murderers in a case I wrote about has written a memoir confessing to waterboarding poaching suspects. It's being turned into a feature film in Nepal. I mean, this is not a secret. It really is out there. And remember, we went in Lobeke, we just thought, how are we, like, everyone is willing to talk to us about this. You know, why is this not kind of more widespread? And so that's something that we're really grateful that we got a chance to work on.
Yeah, I think really you brought up quite some interesting issues because journalists play a great role. I used to be a journalist some years back. And for example, on television, I followed up a series of trafficking of wildlife trade and so on, and it was just the time when we were almost going to the 14th session of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and we were going up to Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, and Egypt was one of the routes and so on. And I thought this is really very risky also for the journalists, because he went all through up to China, Myanmar, and so on, and he talked to local people and was able to see how the wildlife was being trafficked from one place to the other. And some of it is by very, very, what do you call them? I don't know to call them important or very high-class people who are on the top of the everything. And you wonder exactly where are we, and you look at the communities, the indigenous communities sometimes are used to get those particular trophies, and they are sold away and they are given peanuts. I think really highlighting issues is very, very important. And one of the key areas, I don't know if Ogada, you could give your perspective on issues of poaching and why at the end of the day the communities are normally seen as if they are the key people who are a problem instead of the poacher.
Thank you. One of the issues with conservation, particularly in East Africa, is that it thrives on the perception of crisis. There are certain statements like an elephant is killed every 15 minutes. I'm sure many of you have heard that. It doesn't stand up to mathematical scrutiny. Elephants are huge animals. They cannot easily be buried. Our countries would be covered in carcasses if this was the case. But it's been said enough times that this nonsense gets accepted as the truth, especially when it gets said by royalty and celebrities and such people. But poaching is a huge problem. Not so much these days to the wildlife population themselves, but to the relationship between local communities and the environment and this wildlife. Because the overarching narrative, the single narrative about conservation in Africa is that African wildlife is in peril, and the source of that peril is black people. Because when people talk about these deaths of elephants, I'm not sure if those one every 15 minutes includes the ones killed by sport hunting by King Juan Carlos or someone. But they never say that. And you find that that's why I think I highly appreciate the approach that the Buzzfeed people have taken to this, because the single narrative says poachers are local people. You find terms like bushmeat. When it's eaten by a white person, it's game meat. This is there in the media. You've never heard of white people eating bushmeat, even though it might be the very same species eaten as game meat. And the other thing you hear of hunters, poachers. It's the same thing, and it's the media, mainstream media has picked it up, and it's this casual prejudice that has become sadly so widely accepted. When you find that indigenous people are not taken to be intellectual participants. When recently this year, a photographer from the UK went and photographed a black leopard in Laikipia, near where I live, and he was called the first person to see this animal in 100 years. 2019.
I myself have seen a black leopard in that place. If you, not to mention all the local people. But this, as much as it's good to look at ourselves and laugh at ourselves over this, this is the root of a very serious problem, and it's the reason why, while law enforcement, police, etc., carry handcuffs, but wildlife rangers don't carry handcuffs. They carry guns and bullets. They're not going out there to arrest people. Mm-hmm. They're going to shoot. And you hear stories again in the media, especially from Southern Africa, that poachers somehow in Southern Africa keep getting killed by wild animals. These are extrajudicial killings, covered up as wild animal attacks. Otherwise, there'd be no reason why it only happens in South Africa and Zimbabwe. It would happen in Kenya and Tanzania as well. So we have to look, wildlife law enforcement is important, but it must be done in an ethical manner the way all other law enforcement is done. Like the case of this, look at this Walter Palmer from Minnesota who killed that lion in Zimbabwe that was called Cecil. He was never called a poacher. Not once in the acres of newsprint about it was the word poacher used. So we have to look at whether this is actually a problem or just a word used to vilify local communities and justify disenfranchisement on a large scale.
Thank you very much, Ogada. And I think that's very important to look at, since we are looking at conservation and human rights, the fact that communities themselves have also come out and decided they are going to form their own conservancies. And some of them in Kenya, I know, they've contributed their own pieces of land around Masai Mara, and they don't fence, as you say, and they are living with those animals. And apparently those animals are finding it more secure to be right there with them because they think that they are more protected because they are living with people whom they have always, who have always been conserving them and taking care and protecting them. So I think it's another way of saying that indigenous people really, I think what is lacking in terms of looking at conservation and human rights is just a lack of awareness on issues of human rights, is what Ogada has said. And I think to me there is need more to make sure that there is awareness, as I think Tom had already also mentioned, and having these particular issues that we've talked about also of safeguards and a way that a process that can be able to be undertaken to really minimize conflicts and wildlife conflicts between wildlife people and also the conservancy areas. I don't know whether any one of you has any final recommendations that you want to give before we finalize our discussion.
I'd say that, and this is something I've said a few times maybe, but what I'd really like to see, I know that a lot of donors of WWF were really shocked by the findings in our story, and I've gotten a lot of questions, what should I do? Should I stop giving money? And I don't think that people should stop giving money to WWF. I think that they should encourage the charity, and all donors of all charities should urge them to be more transparent, to talk about these issues, to fully outline what they're doing to make it better. And so when you go online and you go to their website and before you're going to give money to them, instead of just seeing these positive puff pieces, you see a real reckoning with the history of this issue and clear steps on what they're doing to make it better.
I mean, one thing that I'd say is animals are very emotive. It's if there were human rights abuses of this nature in educational charities, there would be uproar. I think one thing that has troubled me since we published our stories, when I read the comments under the story, some people have said things like, "Oh, well, poachers deserve to die." Actually, not all of human rights are kind of absolute. Even if people are guilty of things, they shouldn't be beaten. They shouldn't be extrajudicially killed. And there's an issue that because we're dealing with conservation and with the big game animals that people love and they visualize, they have these kind of idealized views of nature parks, is that people are willing to turn a blind eye to human rights abuses. We wouldn't accept this if it happened in an educational charity. We wouldn't accept this if it happened in a women's rights charity. I wonder why we allow it to happen, or why we accept it, or why we seek to rationalise it if it happens in conservation. That's not to say that conservation doesn't have value, it does. It's not to say that conservation charities don't have value, they clearly do. One thing that people have told us throughout this project is they want that. They want a new dialogue, they want a new way of doing things, because what we have been doing has not worked, and in fact it's harmed some really vulnerable people. So hopefully we won't see that any longer in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I think my recommendation is, would be sort of drawing on what Tom said, is like we just have to change the way we think about these things. If you read the fine print on the back of your credit card agreement, read the fine print about the organization you're giving money and ask the right questions. Then local people have to be intellectual participants in conservation. They have to be partners. They cannot be some sort of client community that are told what to do in a paternalistic manner. That boat has sailed a long time ago. The concept, talking about Kenya, the concept of pristine, quote unquote, wilderness without a human footprint is nonsense, doesn't exist. So we should stop trying to sell that as a tourism product. We should stop trying to create that as a conservation tool. There are recommendations on certain levels of protected areas. Protected areas now are an anachronism. Wherever you go in the world, protected areas stand as symbols to human rights abuse way back. We'll keep those we have because it's part of our history, but we must find a new way because to share space with wildlife. We can't go and say we have to have like Edward Wilson's half-earth theory thing. When he first said it, I dismissed it as the arrant nonsense it is. But it's actually gained traction, and National Geographic had an article on it earlier this month saying that the new science says we should have half the world protected areas. It worries me because I know the half to be protected will not be Europe. It will be where I come from. It won't be New York City. So we have to just find new ways of thinking about this and we've embraced technology and education in electronics, in communication, in everything. Why can't we embrace new learning in conservation and reflect the state, our advanced state of knowledge, rather than harking towards something that's no longer relevant? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is very good, and especially closing statements to see that, well, there is a problem. They have to learn from the problem and change. And I think this is what everybody has to take it back home and look at some of the issues more critically, and also looking at the everything towards the our development is very crucial, and that's why governments also look at different perspectives, but we keep on, as journalists, as advocates for different areas, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're civil society, it's important we bring these things on the table because they're really very important for us to be able to tackle them, looking at whom we work with and why it impacts on indigenous peoples and local communities wherever they are. So I would like to really thank you, Tom Warren, Katie Baker, Mordecai Ogada, and thank you very much for being here, and we wish you all the best, and come back again and talk to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.